Greetings and welcome to our MS Exchange Con 2015 focus session on tips for a successful and secure Office 365 journey. We're very happy to have Barracuda as a new sponsor for this year's Exchange Con event. I'm Roger, I'll be the event moderator, and as usual I have a few quick housekeeping items before I introduce our speakers. All participant lines are muted, but we encourage you to use the questions panel to submit any questions or comments you have during today's presentation. We will be addressing questions at the end of the presentations, and we will be concluding in time for those of you who will be joining the next focus session, which will begin immediately following this one. We are using the Twitter hashtag MSExchangeCon to share the links for the subsequent focus sessions, and those links are also available in your email confirmation. Our first presenter for this session is Michael Osterman, President of Osterman Research. Osterman Research conducts extensive primary market research with decision makers and influencers in the IT space and helps vendors, IT departments, and other organizations make better decisions through the acquisition and application of relevant, accurate, and timely data on markets, market trends, products, and technologies. Also joining Michael today is Richard Turner, Product Marketing Manager with Barracuda Networks. He was the Vice President of Business Development and Strategic Marketing at C2C Systems when they were acquired by Barracuda in 2014. Prior to joining the C2C team, Rich was Vice President of Marketing at Content Analyst Company, where he helped to take a startup search software company to a leadership position in several vertical markets, including the legal community. He currently leads Barracuda's portfolio initiative in the Office 365 market. And now, Michael, I'll turn it over to you to get us started.
Well, Roger, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here today. I know that we'll be able to provide you with some very useful information, largely because Office 365 is such a hot topic right now. Lots of organizations are interested in it. They're really focused on how they can integrate Office 365 into their environments, and they frankly have a lot of questions about how to do that. It's not just a slam dunk. It's not just turning on Office 365. There is a lot involved in it. Just a little bit about Osterman Research so you know where we're coming from. As Roger said, we are a market research and consulting firm. We independently focus on really all things messaging and collaboration. We look really at the way people communicate or collaborate in a workplace context, and so we do a lot of primary research. We talk to IT decision makers and influencers, and our focus really is on understanding the problems that organizations experience, what they would like to do in the future with regard to email and collaboration and social media and instant messaging and so forth. And so we really go in depth in our surveys to really understand the problems that organizations are experiencing and how they'd like to address them. The company is coming up on 15 years old, and we are based near Seattle, Washington. So let's get right into it. Certainly we've heard a lot about Office 365, and Microsoft has really been in the game of providing cloud-based or hosted messaging really for a very long time, really more than 15 years. They started really with early versions of Exchange, offering that as a hosted service, and they've had many iterations over the years, but they really seem to have hit their stride now with Office 365. What we have found in a recent research project, and we've actually done several major projects on Office 365 this year, we found that over the next couple of years, most organizations anticipate that they're going to see a fairly significant drop in on-premises Exchange, largely because they're getting rid of Exchange on premises, as they move to Office 365, as Exchange becomes end of life and so forth. We still find a lot of organizations that are using Exchange 2007 and Exchange 2010, and so they're looking to a large extent at Office 365 as a way to migrate to a new platform without having to go through the pain of a migration from one on-premises system to another. So, certainly we've seen this cannibalization of Exchange on premises, and Microsoft has done a very good job at really just transitioning those customers into Exchange Online and the rest of the Office 365 suite. So, while we see Exchange on premises dropping fairly significantly over the next couple of years, we see that slack and more being made up by Exchange Online and Office 365. So Microsoft is, as they have been wanting to do, they're transitioning their user base from an on-premises delivery model to a cloud-based delivery model. We do see, however, that Exchange on premises is not going away. A fairly large proportion of those that we surveyed, and those are, in larger firms, usually 500 seats on up, tend to want to focus on hybrid deployments. And so we see hybrid deployments as becoming the norm for larger organizations. Maybe Exchange on premises for a headquarters organization, and then everybody else is on Office 365. So we don't see on premises going away by any means, but certainly a large proportion of the users that today are served by an on-premises delivery model are going to be moved into Office 365. Here's a little more on that. We've in a recent survey that we did, we asked organizations, what is your current status with regard to Office 365? And as you can see here, about 1 out of 7 organizations have already migrated all of their users to 365. 38% will ultimately move all of their users to 365, but a fairly significant proportion, 28% here, feel that they are going to maintain some sort of a hybrid environment where they'll have on-premises Exchange and Office 365, and a fairly significant proportion just aren't sure at this point. So what we're seeing is, certainly a lot of hybrid, and just that hybrid continuing for many years to come. We've also asked in the survey, how are you going to manage various capabilities, whether you go to Office 365, whether you stay on premises, what have you. And as you can see here, there's a fairly significant mix, and it changes quite a bit. With regard to email, we see still 35% of email users, whether that's Exchange or some other platform, are going to remain on premises. About 31% are going to go to the cloud, but 35% are going to be in some sort of a hybrid deployment. Now, when it comes to security, we see more emphasis on the cloud, more emphasis on hybrid. And so, as we get into DLP, there's going to be more on premises, disaster recovery, business continuity less, and so forth. But the basic message here is that hybrid is going to be a very common deployment model. So it's not a case for most organizations of either or. It's a case of both, managing security, managing DLP, email archiving, encryption, disaster recovery, and even email using a hybrid model. So that complicates things a bit because now you've got some on-premises users. You have to have IT staff that are on premises to manage the servers, the rest of the hardware, the software upgrades, and so forth. You also have cloud management as well, and then you have to integrate that. So it's not a case of just handing everything over to Microsoft and saying, here, manage it. There's going to be that combination, and that is going to be complicating things for email management, security management, and so forth. So in terms of security problems, certainly, we all face, a variety of security problems when it comes to Exchange or Office 365 or whatever the platform might be. What we found in a recent security survey is that 2/3 of organizations have had malware successfully infiltrate their network through email, and 63% have had it come through just simple web surfing. And what we found here is sort of a cat and mouse game over the last several years, and we've been asking this question since 2007. What we found is that the web has gotten progressively worse until the most recent survey when email sort of took that role back. As we'll get into here in just a couple of minutes, because of phishing attempts and more sophisticated cyber criminals and so forth, we're seeing, email, continue to be this major threat vector, but the web is a very close second, and we expect these, to bounce back and forth over the next several years. More troubling, however, is that a lot of organizations have been infiltrated, 23% here, but they really aren't sure how it came in, whether it was through email or the web or through some sort of a social media channel or a consumer-focused file sync and share product, a USB stick. There's a lot of possibilities for how this bad stuff can enter an organization, and a lot of organizations have been infiltrated, but they really don't know how it happened. We've also found that 12% of organizations said that malware has successfully come in through cloud apps or social media, and that 4% have had it infiltrate through IM. So not a huge channel through IM, but still significant enough to pay attention to. So if you're a decision maker with regard to email management or just managing your network in general, there's a lot of things you really have to be focused on. Certainly phishing. That's one of the critical issues that most organizations face. Virtually all organizations that use email have some sort of a phishing component to worry about. Phishing is a very common thing, and it's very easy for users to get fooled. Cyber criminals, if they're targeting a specific organization through spear phishing, as we show here, or if they're just doing a more broad-based phishing attack, sometimes they're very clumsy, but very often they're not. They can craft very specific messages and very believable messages that users will accept as valid, click on a link, open an attachment, what have you, and then malware has gotten into the organization. We also find that whaling is a more serious issue, and these are very highly focused attacks against usually a CFO, a CEO, somebody who usually has access to the corporate financial accounts. And what's even more troubling here, and why it's even more important to have a good security solution to protect your organization, is that very often cyber criminals will launch whaling attacks against smaller organizations, school districts, churches, charitable organizations, those that have sophisticated security needs, but they don't really have the staff in-house to provide training. They don't have the staff to manage security as well, and so forth. And so they're more vulnerable because they just don't have the resources available necessarily to deal with all of these threats. So, spam. We have had spam, and I apologize for the typo there. We have had spam for many, many years, and we've had spam, literally for over 20 years. And although spam is less serious than it used to be, it continues to be a fairly significant issue. There's a lot of spam. At least 50% of the content that comes into the typical corporate email system is spam. And so if you can deal with that effectively through good security on premises or good security in the cloud to prevent that stuff from ever hitting your network, you're that much better off. Spam can also be used as part of a blended attack where it's combined with phishing or some sort of a malware attempt to infiltrate an organization. So while spam, pure spam is not necessarily a really serious problem, it is an issue that organizations need to manage. Then you've got advanced persistent threats. These are long-term continued attacks using really a variety of threat vectors. And these kinds of things can go on for years, attacking specific organizations or groups of industries or groups of organizations in an industry. Then hacking, we're familiar with Target and Neiman Marcus and just a wide variety of organizations that have suffered various types of data breaches and have had very expensive remediation efforts. So hacking continues to be this very serious threat that organizations absolutely have to deal with. So watering hole attacks. Again, a very serious attack that a lot of organizations don't appropriately address. And essentially what cyber criminals will do in this kind of attack is they'll infect a website that they think a particular group is going to go to. This has happened to groups of Apple developers, Facebook developers, and others. And so they'll infect a site that a lot of people that they want to target are likely to go to. These people visit, get infected, and now the cyber criminal has access to the organizations that they initially targeted through the secondary site. Nation-state attacks, we've heard of Stuxnet and Dooku and Flame and a number of others. These are very sophisticated attacks and certainly a threat vector that we see continuing to be a very serious issue moving forward. Again, not against every single organization, but certainly against defense contractors, government websites, and so forth. So there's a couple of fundamental questions that you really have to answer as a decision maker as you plan your migration to Office 365 or as you plan even to just consider Office 365. Question number one is security in the cloud inherently less secure than on-premises solutions? And really the answer is not really. Security in the cloud actually can be more secure than on-premises solutions. Cloud-based security has proven to be very highly secure. If you go visit, for example, leading providers' data centers, you'll find that they're physically well protected with video cameras on the outside, multi-factor authentication to access doors to get to the servers within the company, and so forth. Defenses are updated continually, usually on a minute-by-minute basis or at least every 10 or 15 minutes. And data fundamentally is very well protected from intrusion. So if you're concerned about data in the cloud, if you're concerned about data security when using a cloud provider, you really don't have a lot to worry about, particularly if you look at a lot of the major data breaches that have occurred over the past couple of years, Sony, Target, and so forth. The vast majority of those data breaches occurred from on-premises systems, not solutions that were in the cloud. However, there can be some fairly significant variations in the efficiency and the efficacy of cloud security solutions. False positives, for example, are a very important consideration. It's not a sexy issue and one that a lot of decision makers don't focus on, but if you do have a lot of false positives, if you do have a lot of valid emails that are somehow tagged as spam or malware and then dumped into a quarantine, that can create a couple of problems. One, it can require users to spend a lot of time going through the spam quarantine, looking for stuff that really shouldn't have been captured there, bringing it back out. The other problem you face is that as users go through the quarantine, they may find something that they think is a valid email, but in reality it's a phishing attempt, bring that back out into the valid email stream as well, and now you've gone to the trouble of actually identifying something that was malware, was some sort of a phishing attempt, but the user thinking it was a false positive brings that back out. So if you can drive false positives to as close to zero as possible, obviously you're much better off, but you need to consider security solutions in that context as well. So the second fundamental question to answer is, does Office 365 or really any other cloud-based email platform require changes to the way that organizations manage security? Well, yes. The fundamental answer there is yes. When you're using an on-premises solution, for example, that particular paradigm calls for traffic usually to be backhauled to a centralized security infrastructure for security management using just normal internet connections. And this applies obviously to remote offices, satellite offices, and so forth. The cloud paradigm, on the other hand, allows individual accounts to access the service directly. So if you've got a satellite office in another city, those users are going to go directly to the Office 365 data centers. So they're going to be accessing that independently from the security infrastructure you've set up. And so that internet access can create security holes. If users are accessing their Office 365 account maybe from an insecure location, like an airport or a coffee shop, that can create issues. And so fundamentally you have to address the security issues that any cloud-based email platform is going to create, largely because you don't have the centralized management of it in the same way as with an on-premises system. So one of the critical issues to address is multiple layers of security. We highly recommend that organizations implement those multiple layers and not just use Exchange Online protection, for example. It's a useful capability. It provides some good security features, but it really provides just a single layer of protection. And multiple layers obviously offer greater protection from threats. So even if you're going to the cloud or if you're staying on premises, we highly recommend using those multiple layers to provide additional security for your users. Enforcement really has to be distributed and very highly secure. So you need to be able to access email from anywhere, but you also need to be able to secure it from anywhere it's accessed. And also with regard to the old paradigm, allowing for true best-of-breed security capabilities where you can have multiple solutions from multiple vendors in your own data center, and having all of your email filtered through all of those, the new paradigm's a little different. It requires a modified approach to best-of-breed. There's much more focus on vendors because it's really not practical to have maybe 5 or 10 different vendors in the cloud and have your email filtered through all of those vendors before it finally reaches you. You have latency issues, there are reliability issues and so forth. So it requires a much greater focus on vendors and minimizing the number of vendors, not getting that down to just 1 or maybe 2, but certainly minimizing the number of vendors compared to the on-premises best-of-breed paradigm. So you need to focus also on hybrid capabilities. If you are going to have some sort of a hybrid capability with Exchange on-premises and Office 365, you need to choose security vendors that are going to allow you to manage that effectively, manage all of your users ideally through a single pane of glass. So in terms of recommendations, we recommend that you seriously consider Office 365. It's a good platform. It provides a number of very useful capabilities, and Microsoft has really done their homework. They've done a good job at providing a lot of features and functions within the Office 365 context. There are some holes. There's no SharePoint archiving, for example, or Yammer archiving, and some of the capabilities are not as good as what you'll find with third parties, but on balance, Office 365 is a pretty good platform. You also need to understand that the cloud paradigm really does necessitate a change in the way the cloud security is managed. Again, you can't really have that the same best-of-breed approach that you might have had before, so you need to understand how that changes. And also understand that security in Office 365, provides some decent capabilities, but you need to understand the key differences that are available between Office 365 and those available from third parties. There can be some fairly significant differences between them. Okay, and this concludes my part of the presentation. Here's our contact information, and I'd like to turn things over to Rich now. Rich, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Michael. As always, very interesting research and very timely. What I want to talk about is, all right, how do you take what we've just learned and apply it in a practical sense? So I'll talk about securing your Office 365 environment. And as Michael mentioned, you're moving from an on-premises environment to a SaaS environment, or more significantly, to a hybrid one. These two single threat vectors, and we talk about 6 threat vectors at Barracuda, but I'm going to focus on these 2 because they're the most prevalent, are your network threat vector and your email threat vector. Your vulnerabilities are going to increase. And why is that? Pretty simple. More users on the internet and more traffic through the internet. Both of those are going to raise these threat vectors, and you need to be aware of that. But let's look at this in a little more detail. In terms of network, this is really all about your firewall. And as Michael said, in the old days, you would backhaul everything through a single central firewall, which handled security. But now the firewall has to do multiple things. It's not just security, it's also availability. And this changes the paradigm pretty substantially. Similarly, email, while Office 365 includes some security, typically a customer is going to need more protection and multiple layers. So I want to look at these 2 things in separate. First, let's talk about your network. In the old world, this was a typical network topology, and the large square in the middle are your physical headquarters network, your Exchange, CRM, your websites, your users. Everything was filtered through that blue firewall to the right onto the World Wide Web. Very secure, very stable environment. Guess what? The world is certainly different. This is what traffic looks like today. You've got remote workers, you've got corporate, you've got branch offices, data centers, multiple cloud instances. This is actually one of our customers. They have 2 instances of Azure. They use Salesforce, they use Office 365, and you'll notice there is no central firewall. So how are they protecting themselves? The question is a little bigger than that, because your network becomes a land of equals. Office 365 isn't the only traffic you carry. In fact, at some companies, it's not the most important traffic you carry. If you're running an ERP system, say your business is based on Epicor, that is probably going to take priority over somebody sending an email or editing a spreadsheet. So the 365 traffic needs to be balanced with other needs, which means application access across the network is going to have to be managed on a per user and a per application basis. Now the challenge is that SaaS applications want to operate as if they have a direct connection. This started with Salesforce, but Salesforce was pretty simple. It was really form fill done on the web. Office is true collaboration. Add to that, you have to maintain security. The real solution are what are called next-generation firewalls. Let's talk a little bit more about this. The notion of a next-generation firewall is it's a distributed firewall. As you have these multiple nodes, each one needs a firewall. To be perfectly honest, that slide I showed you with the view today, you'll remember there were multiple little brick boxes. Those are multiple firewalls. They're distributed. can have as many nodes as you need, but there's a single access for management and control. And this is important because every firewall you stand up needs, first of all, consistent policies applied. You've got to be able to track the logs. Firewalls are still important for security. They're still providing things like sandboxing and other advanced threat protection, so you need to be able to go and check what has occurred at the firewall, what threats are happening. Unfortunately, or fortunately, this is how many companies have discovered they've been attacked, or more importantly, have not prevented attacks, but thwarted attacks or shunting them. It's through the firewall. Firewalls have also added some other features over time because, the original firewall is probably a 10-year-old paradigm. Today's distributed firewalls also need to deal with things like load balancing. You have multiple pipes coming into an organization. A firewall may be handling 3 direct connections. It's balancing that traffic. It's also dealing with failovers. What if one of the firewall nodes fails? Where else can it go? And typically we see next generation firewalls for medium to large companies, branch offices. They need multiple access nodes or points. The question comes up, well, what do you do for smaller instances? Is a distributed firewall necessary and available and important for everybody? Well, the answer is actually what's more important is something that can be centrally managed. Here I've presented a live snapshot of what Barracuda calls cloud control. And this is something we've built into all of our Barracuda products, whether they are a distributed firewall or whether they are physical firewalls or virtual firewalls. In this case, the customer is running a fairly typical firewall called an X series. They're not distributed. They're 2 discrete firewalls. In other words, it's a hybrid application. Yet they have the ability to manage all of these firewalls from a central location. So the distributed factor is not essentially as important as being able to manage all of these things from a single place. So that's really what I wanted to get across here, that managing a firewall is going to be your issue. You will have more than one. Okay, let's talk about email security. Totally different subject. Office 365 includes some security, but as I said before, you're going to need more protection. And to explain the differences, I'm going to look at just how email security works. And I apologize if this seems a little high level, or for some people this may seem a little basic. But there are 2 aspects to email security. There's connection management, which is all about the sender. And then there's mail scanning layers, which is what's in the body of the message. And these are the traditional 12 security layers for email security. 95% of all spam is caught in these first 5 layers about connection. And really, it's 5 different things. Who's sending it? Are they real? Is it a flood-based attack? Are they a known spammer? In other words, that's a blacklist or a block list. Are they trusted? That's a known, a loud, or a whitelist. Exchange Online Protection focuses on these layers. In fact, until January of this year, they had very limited IP analysis. Exchange Online Protection calls this IP throttling, but we've looked at it, and it really does much the same as IP analysis. EOP, as Exchange Online Protection is called, can actually look at the content of an email, but that typically isn't its function. It doesn't open the emails. It may see a spurious URL, but it's focusing on connection. And that's the question, this problem. Is it good enough? While connection management can capture up to 95% of the threats, Exchange Online Protection that itself isn't that good, and spam can go up significantly, and I'll talk a little bit about this. The problem with Exchange Online Protection is, Michael mentioned false positives. You've really got only one setting here, how much or how little questionable email you're going to let through. What Microsoft does in its analysis is, if a sender is not already known, already on their whitelist, it is immediately considered suspicious. So we see from customers who get frustrated with trying to go through the quarantine filters, known mail isn't getting through, they start to lower the levels, so that also increases spam. So there's a bit of a problem there. But a bigger problem for Exchange Online Protection is it cannot detect spear phishing. And even Microsoft agrees with this. First of all, encryption is going to be standard in the product by the end of the year. And in June of this year, they launched Advanced Threat Protection, or ATP. So let me talk a little bit about what that does. ATP completes the picture. ATP is designed to focus primarily on what's contained within the email, and it uses a variety of techniques, including machine learning, and they have not disclosed what the techniques are. No, probably will they. Most security companies only disclose a certain amount of what they're doing because otherwise now the hackers know what we're doing. But ATP will interrogate the email. It also will sandbox questionable content, and it will detonate it in the sandbox, which is a pretty typical technique. In fact, we actually do that in our own network firewalls. The problem with ATP is it may be overkill because it's very expensive. It's $24 per user per year. And while it sends content off to be analyzed and protects against any malwares buried inside, this can take time. Typically, this is a 30-minute, believe it or not, lag time between, Microsoft can say it can be as little as 5, but typically this will send it off to their sandbox and it'll detonate the suspected malware inside the sandbox to detect, to basically identify the behavior. That technique itself isn't always successful because malware has gotten clever also, and it can detect the fact that it's being sent to a sandbox, that it's not being executed within the environment, so it will behave differently. So that's all great, a lot of effort for nothing. But Exchange Online Protection versus Advanced Threat Protection is still only a part of the picture. The problem with either of these solutions is you're starting over because you're going to need to rely on what Microsoft provides as their lists. And as large as Microsoft is, they're not really a long-term security player. They're relatively new to this market. They also haven't put a decent import capability because everybody has an existing whitelist. And in one of these presentations, I talked about the core emails, which are hilarious. They go back 10 years when emails were the first 5 letters of someone's first name, the first letter of the last name, at so-and-so, and you can imagine what these end up. We all have those in IT, and we've carefully compiled those over years. Those are the whitelists. So the problem is, without an import capability, with Exchange Online Protection, IT administrators find they're spending a lot of time in the quarantine files. And this is the problem with blocked mail. And if you let the users do it, as Michael pointed out, often as not, they'll bring back something that really is a bad email thinking it looks valid. So the problem is false positives are really your enemy. But the other thing that Exchange Online Protection is going to impact are what's called ham emails. And this causes a lot of grief. And what's a ham email? Basically, it looks like spam, but it's not. A typical ham email is a bulk email to which a recipient is described. In other words, someone has said somewhere along the line, they're a trusted sender. Again, that was added to your whitelist. But the problem is that trust occurs at the user level. And there's really no capability today in Exchange Online Protection to do that. So at the IT level, the IT administrator has a choice. They have a flood of spam or a whole bunch of frustrated users. There's no balance right now, which is another challenge. So what Barracuda does, how do we differ from Microsoft? Well, first of all, Exchange Online Protection is going to be limited because spam is going to get through. The Barracuda solutions are built to incorporate all 12 layers in a single product, so they all have anti-phishing. Now, I talked about Advanced Threat Protection going a step further and sandboxing questionable content, which has some benefits and some drawbacks. We actually add a feature called email continuity, and we found this is very useful for people, even though Exchange Online Office 365 is very robust. It's had very few outages. They do happen. There are also situations where someone can get to the internet and can't necessarily get to Exchange. So we have email continuity. We can send and deliver mail even if Exchange, the server, is offline, as it all gets caught back up when it's back on. This is the example of Barracuda's email security. Again, it's all 12 layers, and it comes in 2 different flavors. And this is, well, actually it's multiple flavors, but this is important, again, if you're in a hybrid environment. It can be deployed as a spam firewall. And when we say appliance, the term appliance no longer really applies. Barracuda offers its products in a physical box, in a virtual box, or hosted in the cloud. The second way we deliver email security is as a cloud service, and a lot of this has been a response to people who want to move completely to provided services. Email security is a SaaS product. What's the difference? In SaaS, we're managing the environment. In the spam firewall, the customer is managing the environment. Which works? Answer, it doesn't matter. We actually have customers to do both. And really, in terms of the Barracuda products, the next step would be check out our website on Office 365, because we find that 365 is a whole suite of issues. Security is one piece. In fact, we consider that the migrate aspect for 365, because you need to have security before and after you get there. There's also the preparation phase. What are you going to do with legacy email? And finally, there's the operational phase. How are you going to deal with preservation, and how are you going to deal with backup? And Michael Osterman and his research partners have done deep dives on all of these. So if you're not familiar with Osterman, again, highly recommend you look at their research on these, because Michael has gone through a pretty extensive deep dive on all the different Microsoft functions. And at this point, I would like to turn it back to Roger. Thank you again for the opportunity, and I believe he wants to take some questions.
Well, thank you, Rich. And yes, we do have some questions. I'll just remind everyone to use the questions panel to send through any questions or comments that you have. Any that we can't get to, we will be forwarding on for follow-up with you via either email or phone call. So let's just dive into the questions that we have, starting with, we are trying to eliminate on-site infrastructure. Do these solutions also run in the cloud?
Good question, and I think I alluded to that. I believe that's a Barracuda, aimed at Barracuda. Yes, all of the Barracuda products will run in the cloud. In fact, the Barracuda Distributed Firewall was one of the first firewall products added to the Azure Marketplace.
All right, very good. Next question is, I read somewhere that Microsoft recommends using a consistent security suite. Can you comment on that?
Oh, that's a good one. When Microsoft launched Advanced Threat Protection, they also launched a series of blogs talking about the product. And one of the things Microsoft said was, we recommend that you use only one security product to protect your suite. And the reason behind it was a little disingenuous, that, you know, this will help improve the Microsoft product, that we'll get advance notice of the threats that are happening, and we'll be able to better protect you. And the furor from the security community was pretty immediate. And a lot of the consultants said, well, that really isn't true from a vendor's user standpoint. You want multiple layers. That just choosing a single vendor isn't always a good idea. Daisy chaining vendors is a very good idea. As Michael Osterman pointed out, you don't want to daisy chain too many of them. You know, if you're going through 5 or 6 steps, it's going to take a while to get email. But you definitely want to have multiple layers of protection.
Okay, next question is, I've read there is a Microsoft backup product. Why can't I just use that for Office 365?
Oh, that's a good question. Even though we didn't talk about backup in this, we were focusing on security. Microsoft's backup product is for OneDrive for Business, not for Office 365. Many people get confused that Office 365 is actually a SaaS product. It's not an Azure product, although it runs in a private cloud that, you know, pretty much looks like Azure. OneDrive for Business is the storage vehicle for Office 365, but they are separate products.
All right, very good. Well, we are running up against our time limit. Our next focus session will be starting in about 5 minutes, so we'll have to wrap up there. So on behalf of msexchange.org, I want to thank you, Rich and Michael, for joining us today. And we want to thank Barracuda Networks for helping make it possible for us to bring you today's sessions. Don't forget to join us for the next focus session using the separate link, which is available in your confirmation email. And we're also making it available at the Twitter hashtag MSExchangeCon. And that will conclude this session. Thank you all for joining, and you may now disconnect.
Thank you, Raj.